Welcome to CWJah Talk number 30. My name is Greg Stafford, and I've been presenting a series of videos that discuss a number of subjects, primarily relating historically and archaeologically to the God we call Jah, as well as to the one whom many believe was sent to the earth by God as a Messiah or Savior, Jesus. I've also discussed other issues that relate to different groups or different beliefs, but most of them ultimately relate back to belief in God and then belief in the Bible as containing accurate history related to God and the people of God and things that we believe God wants us to believe. But why do we believe in God at all? Why does anyone, for that matter, believe in a God? In one sense, that question could be viewed by different people as naive in two entirely different ways. One group who doesn't believe in God might think it's silly to just even ask the question, believe in a God? What God? Where is he or her? And the group who believes in God, when they hear other people who don't believe in God question it, it seems strange and at times naive. Because for those of us who believe based on the best available evidence, we don't just believe, like some may, in a God because that's how we were raised, it's convenient. Belief in a God helps bring people together in different ways, not always for what everyone considers a good reason, but more often than not, societies that have a belief or faith in some higher being that they're responsible to have been organized and or structured fairly well, with different outcomes to be sure, depending on which gods they allow. But when it comes to, for example, the Christian God, the Judeo-Christian God, what evidence do we have that that God is real other than the Bible, other than the things that we've been talking about in association with the Bible, like archaeology, things that are important, things that are supportive of beliefs, whether they involve God or not, right? Ancient peoples, ancient places, ancient activities, wars, and events that we weren't present when they happened. And so we look to this evidence, whether it's written, reliable histories, or archaeology, things that we can dig up or that we see that were there in a different way in ancient times, but that we can get a sense of as well as from the literature and then see what things were like. Okay, so now how do we get to God? We have the world, we have creation. These are things many people point to. This is why oftentimes people who believe in a creator or God, what we're going to refer to as intelligent eternal life today, we'll look at the creation itself and say, well, it testifies to the fact that God exists. Its complexity, its symmetry, its bilateral and other symmetry among living things, and the different layers of process that the earth itself is composed of, whether it's the crust and the different layers of the earth down to the core, or the atmosphere, the different cloud types, the different water types. All these things appear to be imbalanced and working together in ways that provide for fresh water, salt water, and the continuation of living beings or types, creatures. So that in of itself, whether it's a person like me or someone like the Bible, one of the Bible writers, Paul, in Romans, would point to and say that is evidence in itself that someone put this all together. But is that all we have? Is even though that's impressive to someone like me and to others, many others, and I think is good evidence that we will consider in part when it comes to the discussion about intelligence today, how do we get to this eternal God, right? We can kind of see, even if you're not a believer in God, I'm sure you can see why people who do accept a God or a creator look at the different systems of the earth and even outside of the earth, whether it's our solar system, the universe, or galaxies, the universe, these different cosmological or earthly systems and arrangements that provide for the continuation of life on earth and for the division of days, months, and seasons are things that are compelling on some level, right? I mean, even if you don't believe in God or if you just completely reject him, to not be at all compelled by what we can see going on, I think doesn't speak well of being able to understand why those who believe in God see these things in that way. I think whether you reject God or not, you should be able to understand those who do accept the evidence around us and in the universe as indicating intelligence, indicating design, systems that are continuing and that are allowing something to go on that is similar but much greater than what we do. And we're intelligent living beings. And so there's a similarity between what we do and the evidence that we use to show who we are, that whether something was made, and the things that are already here for us that we didn't make, but that seem like someone did. Okay, is that all we have? It's impressive to someone like me. I think it should be compelling even to someone who disagrees that God exists. But I wouldn't expect that necessarily to win the argument. I think it's compelling enough. But people have been insulated in other ways against the idea of God, even if the evidence from creation is compelling to some extent to them. The other factors just won't make that connection permanent or sustainable. So what would? What can we point to as believers in God and from our own reasons, right, from our own good reasons, for why others should believe in God? Well, that's what I want to present to you today. The reason that I came to, not necessarily when I first got involved with religious groups like the Watchtower, which I took very seriously once I started, studying with them and getting involved. And then through them, I learned different things, like we all do from different groups. But then you continue to learn and you realize that this group either has enough for you to continue with or they don't, and you move on. And in the case of me, I moved on so that I could focus on the things I thought were most important. It wasn't the case right away. When I stopped attending with the Watchtower and being a part of their group, probably around 2001, 2002, right before I did the 2003 debates. But I had to do those debates because I had already kind of worked my way toward them. And I still believe the issues involved in those debates with White and Bowman regarding the Trinity and the deity of Christ. So that wasn't an issue as it related to my involvement with the Watchtower and the reasons why I disagreed with them and was no longer working directly with them, even though I just released the second edition of Jehovah's Witnesses Defended, and had just released or was about to release 3 dissertations, as well as do the Bowman and White debates. But that was all happening around the same time, and then I just finished those off. And then after 2003, for sure, it was several years before, at least till 2006, and then it still took a little while because I was going through so much, but it wasn't until probably at least, well, I mean, it's hard to put a date on it, but there came a point when I started to realize, after I stopped associating with the Watchtower, after releasing the second edition of JWD, and then 3 dissertations, and then the White Bowman debates, after that period, there were several years, 3 to 5 years, maybe a little bit more. It's hard, again, for me to tell. I had a young family, was going through a lot, so I had all this happening at one time. But it was a good thing in one sense because it helped me get through not only leaving the Watchtower and some of the beliefs that I thought were not as healthy to my family and to me, of course, or anyone else, but everyone has to choose, and I respect those in the Watchtower who choose. We've all chosen and must continue to. So, and that's what this is about today. Why do we choose to believe in God? Right? If we're not working with a group like the Watchtower, who has certain attractive features like a larger global group, and many other groups do too, but these are attractive features to individuals. If you believe in God and you find a group of people that are working together, trying to do similar things, then you can get a sense of belonging that's very compelling. Okay, so we can understand that. But we're talking about God now. So without those things, if you're not with Watchtower or another group, Catholics, whomever, evangelical church, let's say you just don't follow everything those groups teach, whether it's the Trinity, it's the Watchtower chronology, or the Catholic, authority or history structure, whatever it is, let's just say you don't follow those groups, but you still believe in God. What do? Well, obviously you still do the things that you were doing when you were with those groups if you can. It's just you don't have as many opportunities. But sometimes that then affects your faith, and then you stop doing the things that you were doing as often with those groups, and that can lead to a loss of faith. So really what I want to try to accomplish today is to both relate my own experience in this way and also give to you information you can use to keep your faith. You don't have to lose your faith in God just because the people of God or people you believed were involved with God. Maybe they are, maybe they aren't. It's hard to say sometimes. Even in the biblical records, that's not always clear. And the ones that people thought were not at times. So we can't always determine those things. We can do our best. We can try. We should. But we don't have to answer every question about every group. We just have to be able to answer the most important questions. Who do we worship? Whose teachings do we follow? What are those teachings? And why do we believe in this God at all? So this takes us back to our discussion today. All right. Well, after I stopped associating with the Watchtower, we'll say around 2003, officially, right after late 2003, 2004, in terms of like finalizing the debates and stuff that I had already in process, releasing 3 dissertations, which was somewhat of a critical book against some of the Watchtower policies. So again, it happened earlier than that, but formally and just in some sense, the things I was doing stopped certainly by 2004 and didn't really start again until I think around 2006. That's when I did a couple writings, a couple interviews and different things. I started going again, started using the term Christian Witnesses of Jah, but I hadn't really fully gotten through some of the things that I needed to get through in order to be where I am today. And that is proclaiming these things and the reasons why I think they're good. They're good for people. They're good for me, good for you, but only if we have good reasons for believing them that aren't going to then double back on us and involve us in things that we aren't prepared for, that we didn't really come to God for, that many different groups attach belief in him to. And so it's a package deal often. Whereas when you come to the biblical text, at least, that's not always necessary, where you have to then submit to all these different teachings of people who claim to follow, whether it's in a Jewish sense, Jah, or in the Christian sense, Jesus or his father, Jah. So we've talked about different instances in the Bible before and how the early Christians dealt with each other and worked together at times to give people direction. But sometimes groups today abuse that model and process, and they often ignore key sections of biblical texts that show something totally different. So what we're trying to focus on today is really belief based on the best reasons, apart from association, apart from required association with any group, right? Whether you are involved with Catholicism, evangelical Protestantism, or Jehovah's Witnesses, Mormons, any group, any kind of group that claims to be Christian or Jewish, if it relates at all to the biblical God, outside of all of those groups, I want to focus on scientific evidence you and I can point to, no matter which group we're a part of, or whether we're a part of none of those groups, to show why we believe eternal, intelligent life exists, what we otherwise refer to as God. Now, we do later on, as Christians, Jewish Christians, identify that God as Jah, Jehovah, or Jahol. And these are the anglicized pronunciations, just like Jesus, Jerusalem. We don't use the actual biblical pronunciation because we use the different languages that have been developed since the Tower of Babel and that we've grown up with. There's nothing in the Bible that requires a specific pronunciation of these names. It's a distraction today for many people. We want to focus, though, not so much on identifying this eternal intelligent life as Jah or the biblical God. For us, that's important, and I'm going to focus on that in CWJah Talk 31. But today I just want to focus on what evidence we have to show there is eternal, intelligent life. What we would otherwise call God, whether you attach it to the biblical God or not. Right? This idea of a creator, of a higher being that is eternal and obviously intelligent if we believe he's the creator. So what evidence do we have to show that? We talked a little bit about the evidence that would show intelligence. We'll get back to it in a moment. But this idea of eternality, how can we prove that? How can we prove that scientifically? Well, let's talk first about life and where life comes from. So there's a famous chemist, Louis Pasteur, who many of you have heard of, probably because of the pasteurization process that's used to help make things like wine and milk digestible. And relate that to Louis Pasteur, but he's actually famous for a number of things. We're going to take a look at this summary here that will give us a good summary. It has references, and of course I've checked this out, so it's more or less accurate to the extent that we're going to consider what it has to say about life and where life comes from, and how Louis Pasteur helped establish really a way that you can show life does not happen spontaneously. And this has been known for quite some time. So the idea of evolution, life coming from non-life, is really been rejected as absurd for a long time. It's non-scientific. It's not something supportable by science. Now, because of that, there are some who are promoting an idea known as panspermia, or this idea that, well, as you'll see when we read through this summary here, because of what Pasteur found, other theories have come up that essentially require organisms from outside Earth to be the source of life, whether that's Jah or germs from another planet. But life spontaneously generating from the conditions on Earth is not possible. Let's take a look at this summary here regarding Pasteur and some of his findings. Spontaneous generation says, following his fermentation experiments, Pasteur demonstrated that the skin of grapes was the natural source of yeasts, that sterilized grapes and grape juice never fermented. He drew grape juice from under the skin with sterilized needles and also covered grapes with sterilized cloth. Both experiments could not produce wine in sterilized containers. His findings and ideas were against the prevailing notion of spontaneous generation. He received a particularly stern criticism from Félix Archimède Pouchet, who was director of the Rouen Museum of Natural History. To settle the debate between the eminent scientists, the French Academy of Scientists offered the Alhambert Prize, carrying 2,500 francs to whomever could experimentally demonstrate for or against the doctrine. Pouchet stated that air everywhere could cause spontaneous generation of living organisms and liquids. In the late 1850s, we're just going to read down to here. This is important. In the late 1850s, he performed experiments and claimed that they were evidence of spontaneous generation. Francesco Redi and Lazzaro Spallanzani had provided some evidence against spontaneous generation in the 17th and 18th centuries. But nonetheless, Pouchet is coming and he's arguing for it. Spallanzani's experiments in 1765 suggested that air contaminated broths with bacteria. In the 1860s, Pasteur repeated Spallanzani's experiments, but Pouchet reported a different result using a different broth. So there was a conflict. Pasteur performed several experiments to disprove spontaneous generation. He placed boiled liquid in a flask and let hot air enter the flask. Then he closed the flask, and no organisms grew in it. In another experiment, when he opened flasks containing boiled liquid, dust entered the flasks, causing microorganisms to grow in some of them. The number of flasks in which organisms grew was lower at high altitudes, showing that air at high altitudes contained less dust and fewer organisms. Pasteur also used swan neck flasks containing a fermentable liquid. Air was allowed to enter the flask via a long curving tube that made dust particles stick to it. Nothing grew in the broths unless the flasks were tilted, making the liquid touch the contaminated walls of the neck. This showed that the living organisms that grew in such broths came from outside, on the dust, rather than spontaneously generating within the liquid or from the action of pure air. These were some of the most important experiments disproving the theory of spontaneous generation, for which Pasteur won the Alhambra Prize in 1862. He, Pasteur, concluded that never will the doctrine of spontaneous generation recover from the mortal blow of this simple experiment. There is no known circumstance in which it can be confirmed that microscopic beings came into the world without germs, without parents similar to themselves. And so this shows, and has shown for well over a century, that life only comes from pre-existing life, or parents similar to themselves. There's no exception to that. Not even one. It's one of the most scientifically verified and confirmed facts there is. So we know life can only come from preceding life. We're here now. We're alive. Right? We're not going to get caught up into different theories of our being in a dream state, a la René Descartes, or things like the Matrix. Right? We've talked about it before. Because we can differentiate our waking and our dream state regularly. I do it all the time. Right? And we never operate under such conditions or with such ideas that we're being controlled by an evil demon in our sleep, or something like the Matrix. Right? We can tell we're awake, and we know when we're about to go to sleep. When we wake up, we can set clocks, do all these things. So the actual practical value of those theories is none. Right? We act and operate as if we're awake and can sleep, and that there's a difference between them. That being the case, we're alive. We're really here, is what I'm saying. Life only comes from life, based on actual experiments that have been happening for over a century, decades, and that can be observed and have been observed since our existence. That must mean, in my view, I've not heard this associated with Louis Pasteur or anybody else. It's just something that several years ago I realized had to be true. Because if life only comes from life, and we're here, then life has to be eternal. Because there can be no break in that chain, right? We're here now. We've come from existing life that cannot spontaneously generate. It has to come from parents like itself. Scientifically. So therefore, life must be eternal, because life is here now. It really is. We really are. And so, even though we're not eternal, and therefore the idea of eternality is difficult, right? We can't experience it. So anything we can't experience, but we know is true, is just difficult. But the evidence is clear that it's true. So as difficult as it is, it just shows that we're not the highest being in existence. Life is. This eternal life that's been giving life to life. Let's talk a little bit more about it. So, because of that, what we just discussed, this whole argument of life only coming from life, and so it also therefore being eternal, I prepared this argument called the CWJah, or Christian Witness of Jah argument for God's eternal intelligent existence. Prepared this a few years ago, December 31st, 2017. And notice the summary of the argument in bold here. Life exists. Life only and always comes from existing life. No exceptions, ever. And this happens every day, many times a day. We can test it and we can observe it. It's not like something that happens every so often. It's sort of like, is this really just how it always is? It is. In so many ways, it's not even really countable, right? When we count up all the different things that reproduce in this way. Therefore, since life only comes from already existing life, life must be eternal, since we are here now. Further, since everything alive or anything we have evidence to show once lived is also symmetrical in design with a functional purpose, eternal life must also be intelligent. This eternal, intelligent life is whom Christian witnesses of Jah call God. Identified further throughout our human history by many forms of similar names, but the least disputed of which in our English language is Jah. As I mentioned earlier, we're going to talk more about the reasons why, historically, we point to the God Jah as eternal, intelligent life. We're not going to do that today, though. Today's show is all about proving life exists and life is eternal and intelligent. So we've done the first two parts. It's obvious life exists and we accept it as existing. And because of that, and because of experiments like those done by Pasteur that show life can only come from existing life, we know that life must be eternal. So I summarized here some of the reasons why I also believe it's intelligent. But we're going to get into that more in a moment. But what I did, and I refer to Pasteur down here as well, how the above argument is similar to Pasteur's argument, but without discussing how it shows God is eternal or life is eternal. That's very important to show that, because that's often a reason why people doubt, right? They think that's just too much. It's not possible. Well, okay, if life comes from life, who gave life to God, right? But this does away with that, because we know at some point life's eternal. It's just beyond our ability to experientially grasp. We don't live in that condition. We're not eternal, and so we're not able to experience it in that direct sense. But we can show it's actually what is true, like we talked about earlier. So that's the important point to take away and connect with Louis Pasteur's argument, that life only comes from existing life, that then must mean life is eternal because we're here now. And so that's why it's also important to be able to deal with people like, French philosopher René Descartes, his ideas really, about whether we really even know we're actually alive the way we think we are. But we do, and differentiate between dream states, and whether or not we can ultimately determine whether we can control all of the matrix is not the issue. We don't act that way. We don't do anything that reflects belief in that as something affecting us. And so it's not practical to even consider in the face of this evidence, right? Something that happens every day, we can verify. That happens so many times. Like I said, it's one of the most verifiable scientific findings. Life only comes from life. And it wasn't too long ago, a couple hundred years ago, when people were arguing against that life could actually spontaneously generate. And it took Pasteur and others to stand up and say, hey, wait a minute, no. And that's what we need to do today, and connect it with this idea that follows from it, that life is eternal. And then we go from that to show it is also intelligent. We'll get to that in a moment. But let's take a look. Before I wrote that article, the one I just showed you here from 2017, the CWJah argument summary I gave, I actually, 7 years before that, we'll get to that in a moment, wrote this article in 2010. This is really the first time I put together this kind of argument. Life exists. Life only comes from life. Therefore, life must be eternal. I mean, I've shortened it now. But this is how I originally phrased it. I've updated a couple times since then. But basically, this is what I started with. Origin of life is life or something or someone already alive, just like Pasteur shows. But from this, I also went to show that life is eternal, right here. This provides a basis for claiming it is scientific to believe God or some other superhuman being or alien is also eternal. And that's because life exists based on an all-known, shared, or otherwise available scientific study and information. Life can only come from something or from someone already alive or living. Since based on all known, shared, otherwise available science. See, I word it more, but I was trying to get, just be as complete as I could. Scientific study and information, life can only come from something or from someone already alive or living. The origin of life must be life, because we can show that's always the case. And then based on this, because life only comes from life and life is here now, life must be considered eternal. So from that point is really where I realized this a little bit earlier, of course, before I actually put it in print. And this is what helped me get through that period where, after leaving activity with the Watchtower and being really open and identifiably associated with them through my writings and activities, debates and things, I had to go through a period of several years where I still had some beliefs, what I knew, but I wasn't really doing anything about them because, well, I just wasn't a part of any group. And when you're a part of the Watchtower Society, or probably any group like I was, and many people are, often your activity becomes related to that identity, that group activity. Certainly what the Watchtower does, because everything you do is based on what they do, and you can't really do it apart from them. Not the way they do it. You can do it, I think, the way the Bible wants us to do it, and we do it now. But right after that, I didn't have anyone really. And so it was very difficult, and I got involved with different individuals, people who weren't really Christian, but that I got to be friends with, and I thought were good people in the sense that I could trust in some way. Later on, I found that wasn't always the case, but that's how life is, right? You go through different periods where you allow for association, or you have beliefs that restrict your association. And after leaving the Watchtower, I was more open with whom I associated with, or with whom I associated, just trying to get to know people and give them the benefit of the doubt, as I myself was trying to find a way forward with what beliefs I still retained, and then no longer really being with Watchtower. So when I got through that, and as I was in that, I realized life exists. I was able to go through basically this argument that I put here and convince myself that God exists. He would have to exist, not only from the complexity and design that we see around us, that we'll get to further in a moment, but because life exists. And life must be eternal if it exists, and can only come from pre-existing life. And we have good reasons, of course, to reject beliefs about what is really alive from people like Descartes. So I considered all of that, and everything came back to this. Once I established this, that life exists, that it's one of the most scientifically verifiable things that we can show, and that because of that, life must also be eternal, well, showing life's intelligent is easy. And then it's just a question of, okay, well, who is this intelligent eternal life? We can prove it scientifically. You look at history, and history shows you who's been active in ways that you could then say, okay, that must be that. That's that eternal intelligent life doing those things. And if you've been joining us in our text readings or day text shows, you know that in the early books of the Bible, it describes things in such ways. They're unbelievable and convincing and scientific. It just depends on to whom you're listening. So I encourage you to watch those videos as well, if you're at all interested in more about biblical history and the things it talks about early in Earth's history as well. Things that there are reasons for why this knowledge is available. But I don't want to get off the topic today, which doesn't really directly involve the Bible. That'll come up in our next show. Today we want to focus on the scientific evidence that we can use, like with Louis Pasteur and his experiments, that life only comes from existing life. There's no spontaneous generation. That's been refuted. That's done. Now it's just a question of what's the contamination source, right? Did these germs come from outer space a la panspermia? And then we have to find that source, whether it's creation, whether it's intelligent, or this just random evolutionary cycle, and the germs fall down on these different planets in ways that they have to survive all of the atmospheric difficulties and then make it into that kind of primordial soup you might associate with the origin of life. But then that is not only so unlikely in ways that would require a lot of explanation and support. But when you look even beyond all of that, right, all the different things that I mentioned at the start of the show, and then the different aspects of life that show intelligence, it becomes really impossible to rely on that kind of theory. But everyone gets to choose. And so now I also wrote a paper after these two items. I wrote this one here actually in the same year that I wrote the origin of life argument that we just reviewed. But I revised this article here. This is one of my Elihu online papers you can access through my website, one of my websites, elihubooks.com. I revised this one last year, and so it's one of the more up-to-date articles, but I wrote it originally in 2010 to discuss Miller-Urey's different experiments that they tried to use to show that you could generate amino acids under controlled conditions. But all they really did was generate the very opposite of their conclusion, which was that you could spontaneously generate these amino acids, when in fact they were the ones, intelligent beings, setting up all of the conditions, controlling the experiment, doing effectively on a smaller scale the very thing we say God did. So they ended up proving, in fact, the very opposite of what they concluded. And so I go through their entire article, one of their articles, the main one that I considered relative to this issue. And it's the parts of their article that I quote. It's a small article. That's why I was able to basically quote the whole thing. Are in bold here. Again, I'll put a link below in the description, but you can access it on my site. I go through the entire thing, show their apparatus. This is what they put together in order to control the conditions and create what ultimately ended up being amino acids or an amino acid compound. But again, that they are intelligent beings putting together an apparatus within which they place conditions that then allowed for this to happen. That's exactly what we're talking about when it comes to the creation of Earth. So their attempt to use what they did to show how in early Earth's atmosphere these things could spontaneously be done proved the exact opposite. And that's why we have to be very careful about scientists today. Not that we have to question everything they say. We have to look at what they're really using as support for what they're claiming. And I show here the different structures. So you have Miller-Urey's apparatus that they used within which to create amino acids or an amino acid compound. And here you have all of the different structures that exist that show intelligence, design, balance, model, allow for the continuation of life and conditions, allow us to date things, seasons, time, rotation, new moons, all these things, the galaxy, the solar system, the moon, and the Earth's orbit, I used to compare with that apparatus that Miller and Urey used to generate amino acid compounds. Well, look at these and how they're constructed in ways that would certainly then be much more usable to do the things that were done in them that allow us to exist the way we are now. And so we'll just read the final paragraph here. Miller-Urey ended up demonstrating the opposite of what they concluded as a result of this experiment. Given the extent to which the so-called scientific community has embraced Miller-Urey and has continued to feed the lie that amino acids are the building blocks of life, they're not. They're the building blocks of protein. Protein's not alive unless it's a part of a living organism, in which case the living organism is alive. One cannot help but recall what 1962 Nobel Prize winner in physiology or medicine James Watson, along with Francis Crick and Maurice Wilkins, once wrote. One could not be a successful scientist without realizing that, in contrast to the popular conception supported by newspapers and mothers of scientists, a goodly number of scientists are not only narrow-minded and dull, but also just stupid. So that's one of their own colleagues saying that. So it should be no surprise that someone like me, right, I don't consider myself special in any kind of way, I just review the information. I think any one of us can see that these people are not always right. In fact, they're often very wrong, just like one of their own says here. Okay, so let's move forward just a little bit and talk about some of the signs that life is intelligent. Okay, we've talked a little bit about them, and I showed you some images of systems and the things that we can associate with intelligence based on the universe, solar system, the earth, the atmospheric layers, the different layers of the earth itself. From the article that I wrote, this one here. But let's take a look at some other things. I wrote another blog article back in 2013 about plants, seeds, and trees. I did this series where I did several articles, and I'm going to do several more. Basically, the first part of the title is Evolution Issues, and then I picked different issues I wanted to discuss. And so this one here, note the first part. To sum the odds of evolving life from non-life, unless we accept life as eternal, and then I referenced one of my articles that I wrote earlier, The Origin of Life is Life, are preferable to the likelihood life was created. In other words, people choose the odds of evolution, which are like unbelievably impossible, to 1. I don't even think there's a 1 there, but in terms of the odds, versus what we believe is life coming from life, and life being eternal, and that happening every day in an intelligent way, demonstrably. Well, they'll prefer the odds of evolution over the likelihood life was created, or that it was made by an intelligent being or beings who are beyond humankind. Why? The evidence just doesn't favor that position. But this brief article, which I will go to in a moment here, highlights one of the least noticed marvels in our creation, in this case plants doing math or showing smarts, which I came from someone who had smarts. And so I reference here this article, Plants Do Math to Get Through the Night, posted by Earth Sky and Earth Science Wired, June 24, 2013. The calculation allows them to use their starch reserves at a constant rate, so they run out almost precisely at dawn. We're talking about plants. This is the first concrete example in a fundamental biological process of such a sophisticated arithmetic calculation, said mathematical modeler Professor Martin Howard from the John Innes Center. Plants feed themselves during the day by using energy from the sun to convert carbon dioxide into sugars and starch. Once the sun is set, they must depend on a store of starch to prevent starvation. In research to be published in the open access journal eLife, scientists at the John Innes Center show that plants make precise adjustments to their rate of starch consumption. These adjustments ensure that the starch stores last until dawn, even if the night comes unexpectedly early, or the size of the starch stores varies. The John Innes Center scientists show that to adjust their starch consumption so precisely, they must be performing a mathematical calculation, arithmetic division. The capacity to perform arithmetic calculation is vital for plant growth and productivity, said metabolic biologist Professor Allison Smith. Understanding how plants continue to grow in the dark could help unlock new ways to boost crop yield. During the night, mechanisms inside the leaf measure the size of the starch store and estimate the length of time until dawn. That's amazing. Information about time comes from an internal clock, similar to our own body clock. The size of the starch stores is then divided by the length of time until dawn to set the correct rate of starch consumption, so that by dawn, around 95% of starch is used up. The calculations are precise so that plants prevent starvation, but also make the most efficient use of their food, said Professor Smith. If the starch store is used too fast, plants will starve and stop growing during the night. If the starch is used too slowly, some of it will be wasted. The scientists used mathematical modeling to investigate how such a division calculation can be carried out inside a plant. They proposed that information about the size of the starch store and the time until dawn is encoded in the concentrations of two kinds of molecules, called S for starch and T for time. If the S molecules stimulate starch consumption, while the T molecules prevent this from happening, then the rate of starch consumption is set by the ratio of S molecules to T molecules, in other words, S divided by T. This is not an accident. We're just talking about plants and how they're able to do these amazing things. And then from these little seeds produce these gigantic trees and go through these different stages and give us fruit and food to eat. There are other things. We could point to anything, right? We could go and show that anything in life has the marks of creation, has the marks of design, has intelligence all over it. Anything, you pick it. We'll talk about it. I just picked plants and seeds and the other things that we talked about, including the different systems that exist in the universe, the galaxy, the solar system, the orbit of the moon around the Earth itself, the Earth's atmospheric layers. We didn't even get into the magnetic fields, all the different things that show there's someone putting these things together. Let's look at this. I wrote an article about a year after that last one we just reviewed on seeds, plants, and trees. I did another evolution issues on spider fangs. And from 2014, we'll just read part of it. Spiders have many incredible features, right? When you see a spider, you may be terrified, but it's also amazing, right? It can catch the fly. We're trying to catch flies, and spiders have it. They know exactly how to catch that fly because Jah made the fly and the spider. It does everything right. They have many incredible features, not the least of which is the strength and design of its web. Article you can read here about that. And all of which indicate intelligence and intention, not accidental mutation. None of the things that we see that show symmetry, bilaterally and otherwise, involve any kind of disproportion or lack of coordination or this kind of mutating form of life that doesn't have everything in the right place yet. I mean, everything does. If we were going through this massive evolutionary process, there is no way all of the things that we can see alive today and in fossil records would be this complete and balanced. There might be a couple, maybe, but the majority of evidence would show this mutation, a process of deformity, if anything, right? And that's granting that it even could generate in some way non-spontaneously through some kind of panspermia that doesn't involve intelligence. It gets ridiculous. But let's just take a closer look at these spider fangs. Spider fangs clearly show a design perfectly suited for its capture-kill ability, which helps control insect population and ensure the spider's own survival. Further, on the evident design of spider fangs, here's a quote from a recent article about them. The hollow conical shape of its spider fangs gives them nearly optimal stiffness per unit volume, a measure of their resistance to deformation, making them ideally suited for piercing prey. The fangs are a composite of protein and, I think it's chitin, a carbohydrate molecule found in the shells of many insects and crustaceans, whose microscopic structure is well suited for its purpose, the results suggest. From Live Science, May 27, 2014. The article goes on to suggest spider fangs are so perfect they might inspire scientists to develop better injection needles and other medical devices. So what we humans have made so far with our technology could be improved even more by what they would call a mutation, an accidental formation. Not likely. And then up here, that article I referred to about the strength and design of its web, I did pull up over here. This is from the U.S. National Library of Medicine, National Institutes for Health, 2010, November 1st. High performance spider webs integrating biomechanics, ecology, and behavior. I'll put a link below, or you can get it from this article here on my blog. But we'll just read the first line. Spider silks exhibit remarkable properties, surpassing most natural and synthetic materials in both strength and toughness. And we're just talking about the spider silk web material and the fangs. We're not getting into the balance of the spider, its legs, its ability, to see flies, to capture prey, the way it spins its prey, preserves it, eats its prey. Every single phase of a spider's life we could isolate almost and use to show intelligence in life. We could do that with every single thing that's alive today. You pick it. Bring it to me for discussion. Put it in the comments. There's not one thing that exists today that we can't point to and show some mark of intelligence because it was made. That's why, right? If everything was so unintelligent and the result of a mutation after some kind of generation, constant series of mutations because of all these destructive processes, right? It's something that never happens. But yet if we grant that and get all the way to this point, well, we're never going to be able to appreciate the kinds of things that evolutionists claim are true unless we point back to the evidence to see what's really the case, right? I mean, we can only discuss what is theoretically possible with people to such an extent before we say, well, now, wait a minute. We have to look at the facts about that. What can we actually show? Well, I know what we can show. We can show life only comes from existing life. We can show that existing life has marks of intelligence all over it, whether it's you or me, whether it's the plants or the trees, whether it's the layers of the sky or the seas, whether it's the earth itself, the solar system, the galaxies, the universe, everything we can show, we can point to and say, see, look at that intelligence. Look at what it's doing. Look at how it's operating. That shows the same kind of design, mathematical precision, right? Whether it's the seasons and times that we use because of the conditions of the earth and the sun and the moon, or whether it's the plants on the earth, mathematically deciding how much food they need and when they need it and whether they need it, and then not wasting any of it. That's a design. How is that a mutation? How is that an indication of unintelligence? I don't see how. No evidence has been provided to show that that's the case. And when we see things that operate in those ways, they're usually made. Look at everything we make. Well, that's design. That's intelligence by our own standard. We're intelligent, right? Unless we're contradicting the things that would normally be considered intelligent and related to, in this case, building or design, creation, right? Structure. Our own standard requires us to accept intelligence in life. And the scientific evidence requires us to accept not only that life exists, but that life can come only from existing life. And that being the case, it is also a scientific fact that life is also eternal.